Our talk is about the City of Disaster. Our core readings are The Architecture of Disaster and The State of Exception. My name is Nathan, and there'll be Niels, Justin and George in this presentation as well. So quickly to define what a disaster is, it is an occurrence that causes great distress or destruction and can be classed as a thing or project, etc., that fails or has been ruined. So to introduce New York, we chose 9/11 as the disaster, which happened on the 11th of September, which was a terrorist attack to Western ideology, and it was a sort of pinnacle moment in changing the security and the urban environment itself.
For our second case study, we did about the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, which was hit by a massive tsunami which damaged the reactors and caused a huge meltdown. Pretty much the whole of the east coast of Japan was hit by this tsunami.
So if we look at New York as a city before the attacks, we can see it's a very prosperous city, with people living in collective security. After the attacks, however, we can see that people are now beginning to be insecure and that tensions are high. So, for example, if we look at plans for a new Muslim culture centre nearby, it was met with great resistance because people felt it was disrespectful, perhaps because the attackers were Islamic. And a lot of people have seen this as a great shame, but it's the harsh reality that the attacks have changed the attitudes in the city. And if we look at the proposed plans for the replacement for the trade centres, we see a building that is not revolutionary in its style or architecture as the previous trade centres were. We see something that is shy and conforms to the normal at the moment. And because the World Trade Centers were iconic in their own right before the attacks, because they were formed part of the New York City skyline, it is almost seen as a shame that the next trade centre isn't so bold in its architectural style, and it's clear to see that architecture reflects the insecurity resulting from these attacks.
The disaster of 9/11 shattered the American dream. 3,000 people died on the planes and within the Pentagon. Damage of the collapsing buildings, damaged the surroundings, sent dust and smoke clouds in all directions. The financial trade of Wall Street came to a halt for a week, and planes were grounded due to security risk. During this, George Bush's approval rose to 90%, symbolising the coming together following the 9/11 disaster. Increased combat to terrorism, and then a thirst for war followed.
The artificial disaster attacks what architecture stands for. This is a quote from The Architecture of Disaster, and what it's describing is how the buildings themselves aren't targets for that reason alone. Yes, they do cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, millions of dollars to build, but also the fact that it contains thousands of people. What the text is saying is how the fact that they represent power and how they represent Western ideology and how they represent interfaith cooperation and success is what makes them a target. The fact that the physical existence of the building isn't enough for it to become a target, and the architecture is becoming the target and the manifestation and medium in which to create the attack. And earlier on in the presentation I described how the building replacing the trade centres were shy, and Banksy the artist actually described them as skyscrapers. Well, perhaps this text has helped shed another light on that. Perhaps it's a positive thing. Perhaps it's acknowledging the scar on the landscape that the trade centres have left, and this is sort of a fitting memorial to them. And in another text, in the essay The Inscriptions of Violence, London's Landscape of Commemoration, it describes the landscape, the urban landscape, as a medium in which it maps out different states of violence, so it becomes a way to record events or locations or disasters.
In relation to the 9/11, the State of Exception text talks about the various legal laws and loopholes. George Bush was able to pass bills and conduct trials by military commission and hold detainees through the State of Exception. The result of the attack allowed the government to operate outside of their constitution. The state of exception still continues today, decades after the incident, where detainees at Guantanamo Bay are still held without a trial.
Once the tsunami struck the power plant and the reactor core went into meltdown, the government ordered immediate evacuation of residents within 3-kilometer radius around Fukushima Daiichi power plant. The next day they realized the evacuation radius was not big enough, so they expanded the evacuation area to 20 kilometers. The public health disaster was never been fully acknowledged nor addressed by Japanese authorities. Later, the Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission came to a conclusion that the disaster was man-made and preventable.
Around 18,500 people died due to the tsunami, and 300,000 people were displaced. Due to the massive amounts of radioactive materials released, it has been classed as one of the largest nuclear disasters since Chernobyl.
In the writing The State of Exception as a Paradigm of Governance, Agamben quotes two Latin phrases: necessity has no law, and necessity creates its own law. The government of Japan are used to small-scale earthquakes and have a lot of regulations and response plans in place. But because the scale of initial earthquake and the following tsunami was so big, the response was not efficient as it could have been. The response units were using the existing guidelines and stuck to them throughout the initial phase of the rescue operation. Following the feedback, the government changed most of its existing regulations for more effective disaster management.
Japanese health and radiation specialist Shinichi Yamashita claims that life expectancy of the evacuees has dropped due to depression and alcoholism from being displaced. The essay, The Architecture of the Disaster, states that cities devastated by the disaster should not restore their buildings and erase the evidence of the destruction, but maintain and express the traces of the wounds. Applied to Fukushima, this could be similar to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which also suffered from nuclear disasters and have maintained some of their ruins as a reminder of the damages of nuclear power. Another quote from Architecture of the Disaster is, architecture's possibility of survival in a context of modern destruction lies in the fluidity and adaptability. This can be seen in many cities in Japan, such as Tokyo, where they've constantly had to respond to disasters and rebuild and so reinvent their style.
Both of the disasters manifested in the way of symbolism in what the architecture stood for. However, they are both different in the symbolism. The towers symbolised the American dream and what it stood for, and this then created the opportunity for the terrorists to kind of create a statement about the American dream, whereas Fukushima was a symbol in how the architecture was a representation and manifestation of this idea for technology and hunger for technology to just improve, even though the power plant was a high-risk building in an area that was, perhaps prone to natural disasters.
If we look at the actions taken by each government after the disaster, we can see that their constitutions allow different amounts of emergency powers to be granted. So if we look at America, lots of emergency powers were granted, meaning that decisive and quick actions were allowed to take place. While if we examine Japan and their action, we can see that they took a long time to decide things because they had lots of different organisations talking to each other, with lots of different experts' advice, with lots of different information, creating a confusing and slow bureaucratic approach, which was not successful in creating the immediate response that each disaster called for.
In the aftermath of both disasters, the response was quick, but in both situations the emergency response services responded differently. While the Japanese emergency response units were using their guidelines thoroughly, The New York response teams did what they thought was necessary. Numerous firefighters reported directly to the building lobbies and were given instruction by their commanding officers to proceed inside. Some of the off-duty firefighters also arrived to help, went inside the buildings with no instructions or clear directions of response operation. Problems with radio communication caused commanders to lose contact with many of the firefighters who went inside the buildings. Without a clear direction and guidance, some of the firefighters got lost and were buried under the falling buildings.
In both disasters, emergency services responded well and were quick to evacuate citizens and provide much needed medical treatment. However, they were not prepared for the size of the disasters and were under-equipped and unable to deal with the long-term effects, such as the massive amounts of radiation surrounding the nuclear power plant.
Both disasters had a direct effect on politics and government in both countries. In the aftermath of the World Trade Center disaster, the approval of Bush administration rose to 90%. The public began to support the war in the Middle East, as well as tighter security in airports and other high-sensitivity buildings. Before the disaster, Japanese government had a wide trust and support, but because government took so long to respond to the true scale of disaster, the people started to question its methods. The approval rating of the government fell. There were even some protests to the government response, which was never seen before.
The disaster of Fukushima has brought into question how to support the infrastructure of the cities of the world. Is it worth continuing a risky architecture of high technology? The half-life of a dangerous radioactive plutonium expelled by the plant was about 24,000 years, meaning that the long-term consequences and prospects are grave. There is already signs that the various radioactive isotopes are making their way through the food chains of the Pacific Ocean. Following the Fukushima meltdown, the German government took the decision to shut down 8 of their nuclear reactors immediately and to close the rest of the remaining 9 by 2022. This is just one example of how many attitudes to nuclear power is changing to a more apprehensive stance.
Both disasters had a global effect on cities. People are aware of nuclear disaster more than ever before. In the case of Twin Towers, the effects on symbolism were perhaps isolated locally, and even they were short-lived, but it had a global effect on the way people move between cities. Now, it's commonly accepted to go through the full-body search when passing the airport security, and we are constantly reminded to keep our belongings close to us as they can be removed and destroyed.
A couple of ideas I've come up with to do with the future of Fukushima in New York are for Fukushima, it can be compared with Chernobyl in terms of looking at the area's future due to the amount of radiation across the area. The government has put a 20-kilometre exclusion zone around the nuclear plant. The power plant is still in use, but the surrounding area is almost completely abandoned and spared from human intervention. This will change the ecology of the area, affecting the animals and plant life. Similar to Chernobyl, there could be mutated species and whole new breeds of animals created. The forest will be thicker and wilder, and the farmland will become overgrown. An idea I thought for how New York might be after the disaster. The 9/11 attacks sort of made Americans feel more threatened, similar to public feeling after the Pearl Harbor attacks. They are now aware of the fact that they are vulnerable and can be attacked at home in a devastating way. This could lead to a totalitarian state with martial law and more government privileges under the pretense of national security. Distrust towards Muslims has already become a common theme in the US, and patriotism has taken hold of the country. This could lead to a government that can simply bring up 9/11 and use it as a reason to attack other nations.
Both the disasters have had a worldwide influence in changing attitudes towards policy relationships with government, and the way architecture is symbolic of these attitudes.
So each disaster was an exceptional event in their own right and stand out with unprecedented scales of destruction, and neither nation had anticipated such catastrophes. The way each nation handled the response was different to one another, however, understood through the text, state of exception, where emergency policy is explored.
Both of the events revealed positive sides to human nature, where firefighters and service workers risked their lives voluntarily as well as regular citizens.
Now looking at some contrasts, the two disasters differ in that they are both artificial or man-made, but one was an intended event while the other was an accidental event. The immediate response, however, in the few days following the event shows little difference in the artificial disasters.
However, while both events created lasting psychological damage to citizens, they can be discerned from each other. Fukushima caused damage and displacement, while 9/11 caused damage and insecurity. Any questions? Please see any of us. Thank you. Bye bye for now.